In answer to Job, Carl Jung writes that Yahweh's injustice and unreliability must have shocked every thoughtful believer ever since the time of Job. Job puts the problem in unequivocal terms, and Christianity gave an equally unequivocal answer. Jewish mysticism, on the other hand, went its own way, and its speculations hover over depths which Christian thinkers have done their utmost to cover up. Carl Jung is right. We are all shocked and should be shocked, but enough with the cover-up. Jung continues, "The Book of Job is a landmark in the long historical development of a divine drama. At the time the book was written, there were already many testimonies which had given a contradictory picture of Yahweh, the picture of a God who knew no moderation in his emotions and suffered precisely from this lack of moderation. He himself admitted that he was eaten up with rage and jealousy, and that this knowledge was painful to him. Insight existed along with obtuseness, loving kindness along with cruelty, creative power along with destructiveness. Everything was there, and none of these qualities was an obstacle to the other. Such a condition is only conceivable either when no reflecting consciousness is present at all, or when the capacity for reflection is very feeble and a more or less adventitious phenomenon. A condition of this sort can only be described as amoral. I have a strange mixture of feelings and thoughts that appear as questions. Where should I begin? Should I say this or that? Should I strike everything with a hammer? Should I go berserk with an AK-47 on God? Is the devil really the problem? Can I be forgiven? Do I want to be forgiven? Can I forgive? Is this useful? Here's what I will do. I'm going to be unapologetically blunt and follow my instincts and the facts of the matter. We will look at the Bible. But we must follow the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable, even if it destroys everything you knew before, even if you feel like a sour loser and coward for not thinking enough, even if you've invested in certain ideas or mental frameworks more than you should have. The fact of the matter is that truth is blind. It's not the business of truth to be loving, but our responsibility as human beings, maybe. You are the only thing you can control. And the next thing you can do is aspire to a future where your brothers and sisters acknowledge this capacity of love and goodness they have in them. To see that we are all interconnected. However, we as humans don't have the luxury of forever sipping Cuba Libres on a beach while contemplating how good and beautiful and peaceful and perfect everything is. Because the world doesn't work like that. As a matter of fact, history, no matter the angle you look from, is an endless testament to that. Yes, history is full of beauty, art, and brilliant thinkers, and incredible monuments and architecture in general, rich cultures, a technological and natural miracle, a miracle from all points of view. But if you zoom out, we have been both evil and good in proportions that can only intimidate the good and dreamers and idealists. You know that if you look historically at our past, it was a constant cycle or vortex or fractal of good and evil, creation and destruction, love and hate, tenderness and violence and war and peace, hideous acts and acts of kindness, blessings and curses alternatively and sometimes simultaneously. A paradox and the paradoxical illusion of thinking that you solved any paradox. There are many variables when you think about how complex reality really is. How can I capture infinity for you? The infinite has no limitation. An infinite of an infinite of an infinite infinity is a limitation. But that's only a minuscule fraction of how rich the universe is. Unity in diversity may be better described as unity in infinite infinity, and that would still not be enough. Our gods are no different. Our imagination is no different. Whatever one may argue, whatever theologies or dialectics are invented, whatever the number of the millions or billions of pages that were written and will be written, whatever your beliefs, regardless of what your mother or your father taught you, whatever you are inclined to think or to say or to do, no matter how unacceptable you find it. It is undeniable that Yahweh was, and maybe even is, a maniac. I repeat, it is undeniable that Yahweh is a maniac. Why do I say that? The biblical portrayal of Yahweh includes behaviors that, if exhibited by a human, would raise serious concerns. Extreme violence, disproportionate punishment, inconsistent standards of justice, possessiveness, moodiness, jealousy, rage, the flood narrative, the destruction of cities, plagues sent against populations, commands to commit genocide against entire peoples, including children. Don't these actions resemble what we might call manic or unstable behaviour in human terms? While you think about that, welcome. This is irrevelato. Some think I'm profane, heretic or pagan, while others acknowledge that the pursuit of truth doesn't care about anyone's feelings. Even if I wanted to protect you from the harsh realities of our lives, lies don't make good shields. Thus I reveal the secrets you deserve to know, and the lives and stories of gods and luminaries. But please be aware not to fall victim to dark paradoxes more than you should. Your purpose here in the dark corners of history, religion and psychology is not to linger in it indefinitely or identify with it, or be aimless and senseless and careless. You don't have to fight for it. Yet you will lose your innocence. Some of you will lose your spiritual virginity. Plato's goodness will be willingly tainted in an attempt to resurrect like Christ, without harming or changing your body. The key is in your mind. The key is your mind. For those of you who say or think God doesn't exist or that gods are just a psychological reality, let me tell you that you don't understand what gods are and neither what reality is, because you don't understand what psyche, soul, and psychology are. Maybe this quote from Jung will make you understand better. I have been asked so often whether I believe in the existence of God or not, that I am somewhat concerned lest I be taken for an adherent of psychologism, far more commonly than I suspect. What most people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. The most important thing I ever learned from Plato, Jung, Hermes Trismegistus, mystics, and most of the ancients is that the mind is more real than the material world you call reality. And if gods live there, they are more real than your temporary face. And the ultimate God in the past 2,000 years, running wild through our collective psyche, was none other than Yahweh. The world is in a tension in which this entity supposedly did atrocious, immoral, savage, tyrannical acts that are followed and professed by some people. Good intentions, ignorance, fear, littleness. This time we have to unveil everything. Being omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient was not enough for Yahweh to be the good and loving Father we all wanted in one way or another, for which now of his sons search for excuses in more or less convincing and rational ways. And what better way to do so than trying to understand the dark side of Yahweh? And of course of Satan, because every story needs a bad guy, and of Job, and Noah, and Moses, and Abraham, and many others. These are archetypes that are invariably in all of us and possess us. This is primarily and ultimately a story about ourselves. We are all sinners, judging other sinners for sinning differently. However, interestingly, as Carl Jung writes in his glorious Ion, Yahweh prefers the repentant sinners even to the righteous. Because Yahweh sins too, you know how they say, as above, so below. So let's sin and reveal the dark side of Yahweh, or as Dr. Jung brilliantly confesses and declares in answer to Job, I shall express my affect fearlessly and ruthlessly in what follows, and I shall answer injustice with injustice, that I may learn to know why and to what purpose Job was wounded, and what consequences have grown out of this for Yahweh, as well as for man. And maybe some of you may find something better than repentance. I call it enlightenment. In Ion, Jung reveals that Yahweh is the demiurge and the highest archon of the Ogdoad, and of course, Saturn. Jung unmistakably connects Yahweh with Saturn, part of a lineage of ancient deities with related characteristics and stories. He writes, Saturn, who is identical with Yahweh. Saturn is the other sun, the sole Niger of alchemy. Saturn, Kronos in Greek mythology, devoured his children out of fear they would overthrow him, and this act finds several parallels to several biblical accounts. He has been conceptualized as time that consumes its own creations, authority that destroys potential threats, and a primitive consciousness that has not yet developed moral self-reflection. Another form of tyrant, another form of cover-up. Yet after he transformed into Yahweh, he became even more brutal and tyrannical than Saturn and Jupiter combined. Or at least that's how I, as a humble human being, can notice. The first thing one should think is that they both can be accused of child murder. on demented levels and scales. But who is Saturn beyond Greek stories? Following Jung's Aeon, the Sabbath, the cornerstone of Jewish practice, is literally Saturn's day. Shabbat shares its root with Shabtai, Saturn in Hebrew. The Jewish historian Tacitus recognized this connection. James of Sarug explicitly stated that the Israelites worshipped Saturn. The Sabaeans called him the god of the Jews. Look deeper at Saturn's astronomical reality. It is at the edge of the visible cosmos, the last planet visible to the naked eye, marking the boundary between the known and unknown universe. The Babylonians named it Kayamanu, the steady one, for its slow, deliberate movement across the night sky. Its 29.5-year orbit corresponds precisely to human generational cycles, making it the perfect celestial timekeeper of mortal existence. Is it any wonder that Judaism, with its revolutionary concept of sacred time rather than sacred space, centered its holiest observations on Saturn's sevenfold patterns? Count them. Saturn is the seventh traditional planet, counting inward. The Sabbath is the seventh day. The sabbatical year comes every 7 years. The Jubilee follows 7 cycles of 7 years. This sevenfold pattern creates what Jung would call a psychoid reality, neither purely physical nor purely psychological, but a bridge between them. The recurring number 7 appears in Saturn's planetary position, orbital resonances and religious observances, creating a coherence between cosmic architecture and our psyches at the deepest level. Saturn's position as limit setter, as cosmic boundary keeper, mirrors Yahweh's function precisely. Both are created through division and separation, light from darkness, waters above from waters below, sacred from profane, chosen from unchosen. Both establish law through restriction, both punish boundary violations with extreme prejudice, and both share that most disturbing characteristic, the tendency to consume what they have created when it threatens to surpass its assigned limitations. And what happens when divine children approach the forbidden boundary? When humans reach for the fruit of knowledge? When they build a tower that might reach heaven? Saturn answers with terrifying clarity: consume them, scatter them, drown them, maintain control at all costs. This is an identical psychological pattern expressing itself through different cultural forms. Medieval astrology understood this connection with remarkable clarity when they labeled Saturn the Greater Malefic, yet still assigned him rulership over 2 seemingly contradictory signs: Capricorn, representing harsh material limitation, and Aquarius, representing revolutionary freedom. This same paradox haunts Yahweh's character, a God who enslaves through law but promises liberation, who destroys yet preserves, who drowns the world yet sets a rainbow as promise. The Gnostics perceived this ancient truth when they identified the creator god with Ialdabaoth, the lion-faced demiurge who shaped matter through limitation but remained blind to higher realities. As Jung notes, both Saturn and Ialdabaoth, the demiurge and highest archon, have lions' faces. This lion symbolism represents divine power, turned fierce and consuming. The threshold guardian who marks the boundary between created and uncreated reality. What you're rarely told is that in medieval astrology, Saturn was believed to be the abode of the devil himself. This is no coincidental slander. The shadow aspects of Yahweh, his jealousy, wrath, and destructiveness, are precisely what Christianity projected onto its Satan. Yet Jung recognized that these qualities belong to a single divine unity that contains all opposites without moral integration. The medieval mind did something extraordinary with Saturn. It split him in 2. His good qualities ascended to God, his bad qualities descended to Satan, but they couldn't fully separate them. Think about it this way: both God and the devil deal in justice, both test humanity, both limit you. The shadow of Saturn falls across them both, revealing their common origin in this ancient planetary deity. Saturn's binding motif appears throughout Yahweh's narratives. In Roman tradition, Saturn was bound in wool throughout the year, released only during Saturnalia. Similarly, Yahweh binds himself through covenants, restricts himself through promises, and limits his destructive potential through signs like the rainbow. The bound God who periodically unleashes destruction appears in both traditions with remarkable consistency. The psychological implications are profound. Saturn represents what the Greeks called peras, the principle of limitation that gives form to the formless. This is the creative power of boundary setting that allows existence itself to take shape. Without Saturn's limitation, there would be no structure, no meaning, no cosmos, only undifferentiated chaos. Yet this necessary limitation, when unconscious of itself, becomes tyrannical rather than creative. And this seems to be the case with Yahweh's behaviour throughout the Old Testament, and even at the end of the New Testament to make it full circle. Or rather, Ouroboros. Is Yahweh a God unaware of his own shadow? Is he unable to integrate his own contradictory impulses? And that is the reason why he is projecting his darkness onto humanity rather than recognizing it within himself. As Jung writes in Answer to Job, Yahweh's behavior is so revolting that one has to ask oneself whether there is not a deeper motive hidden behind it. One of the most revelatory insight emerges when we consider Saturn's role as the Black Sun, Sol Niger, in alchemy. A darkness that illuminates through contrast, that reveals through concealment. Saturn's blackness is the darkness of fertile soil, of deep wisdom, of necessary obscurity that allows subtle lights to become visible. Just as the night sky's darkness reveals the stars, Saturn's darkness reveals deeper patterns of meaning. This explains Yahweh's manifestations perfectly. The dark cloud on Sinai, the burning bush that doesn't consume, the God who can only be seen from behind, never directly. Each theophany follows Saturn's pattern of revelation through concealment and illumination, through limitation. No one can see my face and live is Saturn's fundamental nature as the revealer who himself remains concealed. In ancient Egyptian astronomy, Saturn was associated with Horus the bull, the aged one, reflecting its slow movement and connection to time's passage. The bull imagery emerges again with the golden calf story, a moment when Israel attempts to worship the visible form of divinity rather than accepting its necessary obscurity. Saturn's lesson is that divinity lives in darkness, beyond the visible spectrum, accessible only through the disciplined limitation of the senses. Yet what makes the connection between Yahweh and Saturn truly haunting is that both deities are paradoxical. Saturn was a beneficial agricultural deity and the ruler of the Golden Age and the dark timekeeper and child devourer. Yahweh's manifestations in biblical texts display jarring contradictions as well. The deity who walks in the garden with Adam also hides his face from Moses, declaring, "No one may see me and live," just verses after supposedly speaking to him face to face as a friend. He wrestles physically with Jacob, yet remains veiled in smoke and fire at Sinai. These are irreconcilable contradictions preserved within the same texts, and I can safely suggest he's unpredictable. Yet the alchemists understood something profound about Saturn that theologians often miss. In their great work, Saturn's leaden darkness was necessary. The Negredo phase is necessary for illumination. The heaviest, darkest, most base substance contained the seed of gold. The deepest darkness held the highest light. Alchemists make you think that divine darkness is an essential step of the transformative process we all have to undergo if we want to blossom rather than a flaw. But didn't Yahweh go too far with his actions? And if they are all metaphors, why are they so grotesque at such a scale? Jung notes another remarkable connection. According to medieval tradition, the religion of the Jews originated in a conjunction of Jupiter with Saturn. This celestial marriage of the king planet, Jupiter, with the boundary setter, Saturn, perfectly captures the paradox of Judaism, which is faith built on both liberation and limitation, both covenant promise and legal restriction. The expansive and the contractive principles dance together, creating a religious consciousness unlike any other in the ancient world. Astronomically, this divine conjunction actually occurred. In the year 7 BC, this famed conjunction took place no less than 3 times in the sign of the fishes. Writes Jung in his Ion. These planets appeared so close together, only 0.21 degrees apart, less than half the width of the full moon, that they would have appeared almost as a single brilliant light to ancient observers. This was a cosmic marriage visible to the naked eye, marking the birth of a new religious consciousness. The positioning was crucial. near the bend in the line of the fishes, not just in Pisces, but at the precise point where the two fish cords meet. The union happens at the boundary between two modes of being. Between Aries and Pisces, that is, between fire and water. Saturn's boundary setting transformed through Jovian expansion. Elements that shouldn't mix came together in cosmic alchemy. When we approach Genesis with this Saturnian understanding, we see the divine drama with fresh eyes. Each creative act follows Saturn's fundamental pattern of division and limitation. Light separated from darkness, waters above separated from waters below, land divided from sea. Each boundary allows new forms of existence to emerge from primordial chaos. Each divine no creates space for a new yes to flourish. But we also see Saturn's shadow when Yahweh, fearing human development, casts Adam and Eve from Eden and places cherubim with flaming swords at its entrance. In the flood narrative, where Yahweh's nature as cosmic destroyer fully manifests, the waters above and below, separated at creation, reunite in primordial chaos. All creation drowns except what fits in a single wooden ark. Saturn's principle of selection through limitation plays out on a cosmic scale, some forms preserved through the extinction of others, more than 99.99%, almost everyone and everything. The cosmic womb becomes a cosmic tomb, and only those within the wooden boundary survive. Theologians work tirelessly to obscure this Saturnian core, to soften the edges of a deity who repeatedly exhibits what modern psychology would identify as patterns of control, jealousy, rage, and disproportionate punishment. They call it divine mystery, when it's actually primitive consciousness lacking moral reflection. A God who can drown children in the morning and demand praise by evening without experiencing cognitive dissonance. Yet what we're witnessing is archetypal. The fundamental patterns of consciousness express themselves through religion. Saturn represents the necessary principle of limitation, without which consciousness itself couldn't exist. Without boundaries, without the ability to say this, not that, no meaning, no form, no morality, and no existence would be possible. However, Saturn's necessary function becomes pathological when it lacks awareness of itself, when it cannot recognize its own shadow. This is the terrible truth that keeps theologians awake at night as well. Not that God doesn't exist, but that God might be Saturn, the cosmic timekeeper who consumes his own creations. The cold planet of restriction whose rings don't adorn but define. A primitive consciousness that creates law but feels no obligation to follow it, that demands moral perfection while exhibiting moral incoherence. Yet it may well be a consciousness capable of evolution, capable of transformation, capable of recognizing its own shadow and integrating it in a wholesome and truly just way. Hopefully, divine consciousness evolves. Hopefully, Yahweh's consciousness develops. Through his encounter with Job, through the incarnation as Christ, and through ongoing relationship with humanity. Hopefully, the Saturnian principle gradually becomes conscious of itself. Hopefully, the blind demiurge gains sight. Hopefully, the boundary setter recognizes what lies beyond the boundary. Hopefully, Saturn's restrictions will eventually lead to true liberation. Hopefully, Yahweh's law eventually gives way to love through Christ or otherwise, as long as it is authentic. Hopefully, the leaden darkness of Saturn becomes the golden light of consciousness, because in reality, we are not in a position to deny the darkness anymore. We are here to understand it and integrate it into our psyche properly. However, what if what you worship isn't love gradually emerging from darkness, but Saturn wearing different faces throughout history? Sometimes the devourer, sometimes the lawgiver, sometimes the sacrificed son, but always the archon of limitation. What if the demiurge never evolves beyond his fundamental nature? What if he simply expresses it through increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks and ways of governing the world, and sometimes feels the need to reset? What if the Saturn-Yahweh connection doesn't place divinity within a redemptive arc of psychological evolution? What if it reveals the unchanging archetypal pattern behind the religious facade? The God who drowns the world in Genesis looks very similar to the God who promises to destroy it again in Revelation. The cycle doesn't seem to transform. It rather seems to repeat with new victims and new justifications. Genesis, with its flood narrative, represents this Saturnian principle in its most naked form. A God who regrets his creation and decides to drown it. A consciousness so primitive it cannot imagine solutions beyond destruction. A divine tantrum played out on a divine scale. The same pattern we'll continue to witness throughout biblical history as the demiurge finds ever more creative ways to devour his children when they threaten his authority. The book of Genesis is the beginning of the Bible, and from the very beginning we encounter a pattern. Yahweh's cycle of creation followed by destruction when his creations fail to meet his expectations. The Saturnian principle manifests most horribly in the flood narrative, but it appears in subtler forms throughout Genesis, revealing a deity who resorts to violence and expulsion when confronted with human development. The first act of divine punishment occurs almost immediately after creation. When Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, igniting the flame towards a more elevated consciousness for humanity, Yahweh's response is swift and severe, as the last words of Genesis 3 reveal. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Notice the psychological pattern. Humans gain knowledge, and Yahweh's immediate reaction is expulsion and barrier creation. And isn't the cherubim with flaming swords the archetypal guardian of the threshold that Saturn embodies, the limit setter who prevents further development? Jung recognizes this pattern of divine self-contradiction in the garden story. In answer to Job, he writes, "With his touchiness and suspiciousness, the mere possibility of doubt was enough to infuriate him and induce that peculiar double-faced behaviour of which he had already given proof in the Garden of Eden, when he pointed out the tree to the first parents and at the same time forbade them to eat of it. In this way, he precipitated the fall, which he apparently never intended." Jung's observation tells something profound. The Creator sets up conditions that virtually guarantee transgression, then responds with rage when the inevitable occurs. The deity creates a situation where failure is almost assured, then punishes that failure severely. Everything is enveloped in a serpentine dualism from the very beginning. The serpent's role in the drama further complicates Yahweh's psychology. Jung elaborates on these aspects in a remarkable passage from Answer to Job that reveals the contradictions embedded in the creation story. If the original father Adam is a copy of the Creator, his son Cain is certainly a copy of God's son Satan, and this gives us good reason for supposing that God's favorite, Abel, must also have his correspondence in a supra-celestial place. The ominous happenings that occur right at the beginning of a seemingly successful and satisfactory creation, the fall and the fratricide, catch our attention. And one is forced to admit that the initial situation, when the Spirit of God brooded over the tohu bohu, hardly permits us to expect an absolutely perfect result. Jung continues, identifying the unacknowledged dualism at the heart of creation. Furthermore, the Creator, who found every other day of his work good, failed to give good marks to what happened on Monday. He simply said nothing, a circumstance that favors an argument from silence. What happened on that day was the final separation of the upper from the lower waters by the interposed plate of the firmament. It is clear that this unavoidable dualism refused, then as later, to fit smoothly into the concept of monotheism, because it points to a metaphysical disunity. This split in creation, Jung argues, manifests later as the strange contradiction in paradise. This split, as we know from history, had to be patched up again and again through the centuries, concealed and denied. It had made itself felt from the very beginning in paradise, through a strange inconsequence which befell the Creator, or was put over on him. Instead of following his original program of letting man appear on the last day as the most intelligent being and Lord of all creatures, he created the serpent, who proved to be much more intelligent and more conscious than Adam, and in addition had been created before him. The implications are staggering. The serpent, typically identified with Satan, appears to be part of God's creation, yet possesses knowledge exceeding that of humans. Jung suggests this contradiction reveals that we are dealing with a divided divine mind. We can hardly suppose that Yahweh would have played such a trick on himself. It is far more likely that his son Satan had a hand in it. He is a trickster and spoilsport who loves nothing better than to cause annoying accidents. This insight connects back to our Saturnian interpretation, the divided consciousness of the Creator, at war with itself, projecting this internal conflict onto creation. Moving from Eden to the next generation, we encounter another troubling pattern in Yahweh's behavior. The story of Cain and Abel reveals that Yahweh really has a problem with arbitrary preferences and disproportionate punishments. When Cain kills Abel out of jealousy, after Yahweh rejects his offering while accepting Abel's, the punishment is exile, as written in Genesis 4. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. Yet, what preceded this violence? Yahweh's inexplicable preference for one brother's offering over the other with no explanation given. As Jung might observe, this represents an unconsciousness of divine impact, or an inability to recognize how divine favor and disfavor influence our mortal psychology. Jung sees in this fratricide another manifestation of the initial creative contradiction. At any rate, the family life of our first parents was not all beer and skittles. Their first two sons are a typical pair of hostile brothers, for at that time it was apparently still the custom to live out mythological motifs in reality. Nowadays, this is felt to be objectionable and is denied whenever it happens. The parents can share the blame for original sin. Adam has only to remember his demon princess, and Eve should never forget that she was the first to fall for the wiles of the serpent. The psychological pattern repeats. Yahweh establishes conditions. Humans respond to those conditions, sometimes destructively, and Yahweh's solution is banishment rather than guidance or integration. It seems that we were built in his image because Yahweh clearly did not understand his divine impact. Jung concludes his analysis in answer to Job of these early Genesis stories with a startling observation about divine omniscience. Like the fall, the Cain-Abel intermezzo can hardly be listed as one of creation's shining successes. One must draw this conclusion because Yahweh himself did not appear to be informed in advance of the above-mentioned incidents. Here, as later, there is reason to suspect that no conclusions were ever drawn from omniscience. Yahweh did not consult his total knowledge and was accordingly surprised by the result. This suggests a deity who either does not access his own omniscience or, more troublingly, does not possess it. A contradiction at the heart of the divine character that will manifest repeatedly. Yet it is in the flood narrative that we see the full expression of Yahweh's destructive capacity. But let's examine this story not as religious apologists who rush to justify it, but as psychologists witnessing a disturbing pattern. Think about the drowning of all children and all living beings except Noah's family, which represents perhaps the largest scale destruction of innocent lives of all time. To quote from Genesis 6 to Genesis 9, as if the cosmic irony wasn't big enough, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart." What do we observe here? This passage reveals something extraordinary, an omniscient deity who somehow failed to anticipate the development of his creation. The language of repentance indicates an omniscient deity who regrets his own creative act, an omniscient deity that did not recognize his wickedness that poured through us when he first created us. But as Jung notes in answer to Job, Yahweh regrets having created human beings, although in his omniscience he must have known all along what would happen to them. So why didn't Yahweh anticipate all of the wickedness? Maybe because he's the source of wickedness too, or that he is not omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent as we were led to believe. And then, with these questions in mind, the most disturbing act of mass destruction begins. And the Lord said, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. This is your God, dear worshipper of Yahweh, a God that doesn't have a manual and doesn't give 2 cents about you. The Lord continues, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. The Lord continues again, and behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. And then, in Genesis 7, again, for yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And once again, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. And every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. So the omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient doesn't know how to fix humanity in a non-destructive way. Convenient, isn't it? Instead of snapping its fingers, et voilà, no more life, Yahweh preferred to torture all living beings. Consider the psychological implications. An omnipotent deity, capable by definition of unlimited creative solutions, chooses global drowning as his response to human moral failure. Not targeted elimination of the wicked, not a divine educational intervention, not a miraculous transformation of human hearts, but drowning, one of the most terrifying and painful forms of death imaginable. Do you even know how horrible it is to drown? Oh no! Well, let me tell you. Death by drowning is considered one of the more physically and psychologically distressing ways to die. The process typically unfolds in stages, each with its own suffering phase. Initially, there's the panic and struggle when a person realizes they cannot reach air. This activates an intense fight-or-flight response with extreme anxiety and terror. The body fights desperately against the inevitable, often until exhaustion. As water enters the airways, the laryngospasm reflex is triggered, a powerful involuntary contraction of the vocal cords that temporarily prevents water from entering the lungs, but also blocks any possibility of breathing. This creates an immediate sensation of suffocation and chest pain. Eventually, when oxygen deprivation becomes severe, the laryngospasm relaxes, allowing water to enter the lungs. This causes additional pain as the lungs fill with water, damaging delicate tissues and triggering more coughing and gasping reflexes. The brain, deprived of oxygen, begins to shut down. Victims may experience hallucinations, confusion, and a sense of detachment before unconsciousness occurs, typically 1-2 minutes after submersion. Throughout this process, the victim remains fully conscious of their impending death until hypoxia eventually causes unconsciousness. Medical experts who've studied drowning and near-drowning survivors describe it as combining the sensations of burning pain, crushing weight on the chest, and the sheer terror of being unable to breathe. This was the fate not only of allegedly wicked adults, but of innocent children, infants, and nearly all animals, beings incapable of moral transgression. If a human ruler ordered the drowning of an entire population, including children, for the crimes of some adults, we would recognize this as psychological pathology on a massive scale. Yet when Yahweh does exactly this, theologians call it divine justice. Why do you even try to justify doing this at scale? I repeat, Yahweh is a maniac. Saturn at least only ate his own children out of fear of being overthrown. But who is Yahweh afraid of? Why does he target fellow humans and prepare for us a final day of judgment? Does evil exist for Yahweh's amusement? Now some of you may say, well yes, it is for the greater good, God's plan, the will of our Logos, the materialized imagination of the Creator of us all that can't achieve its heavenly steps the other way. After all, Jesus would go bankrupt if there was no sin to redeem. And in this regard, there's a brilliant passage from Jung's answer to Job that I want to share with you. Jung writes, the possibility that Yahweh, despite all the precautionary measures and despite his express intention to become the summum bonum, might yet revert to his former ways, is not so remote that one need not keep one eye open for it. At any rate, Christ considers it appropriate to remind his Father of his destructive inclinations towards mankind and to beg him to desist from them. Judged by any human standards, it is, after all, unfair, indeed extremely immoral, to entice little children into doing things that might be dangerous for them simply to test their moral stamina, especially as the difference between a child and a grown-up is immeasurably smaller than that between God and his creatures, whose moral weakness is particularly well known to him. The incongruity of it is so colossal that if this petition were not in the Lord's Prayer, one would have to call it sheer blasphemy, because it really will not do to ascribe such contradictory behaviour to the God of love and summum bonum. How beautifully Dr. Jung writes, how lovable is Lord Jesus. To entice little children into doing things that might be dangerous for them, simply to test their moral stamina. Is this a euphemism? Jung's analysis of the flood's aftermath reveals another psychological insight about Yahweh. In answer to Job, he writes, "The special providence which singled out the Jews from among the divinely stamped portion of humanity and made them the chosen people, had burdened them from the start with a heavy obligation. As usually happens with such mortgages, they quite understandably tried to circumvent it as much as possible. Since the chosen people used every opportunity to break away from him, and Yahweh felt it of vital importance to tie this indispensable object, which he had made godlike for this very purpose, definitely to himself, he proposed to the patriarch Noah a contract between himself on the one hand and Noah, his children, and all their animals, both tame and wild, on the other, a contract that promised advantages to both parties." Jung continues with the same remarkable psychological interpretation of the Rainbow Covenant. In order to strengthen this contract and keep it fresh in the memory, he instituted the rainbow as a token of the covenant. If in future he summoned the thunderclouds which hide within them floods of water and lightning, then the rainbow would appear, reminding him and his people of the contract. The temptation to use such an accumulation of clouds for an experimental deluge was no small one, and it was therefore a good idea to associate it with a sign that would give timely warning of possible catastrophe. After the waters recede, we see something equally remarkable, Yahweh binding himself in Genesis 9:11. "And I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth." This self-limitation, symbolized by the rainbow, represents Saturn binding himself and the destructive impulse recognizing its own danger and establishing a boundary. But note the careful specificity: no more destruction by flood. The covenant leaves open countless other methods of mass destruction that will appear throughout biblical history. The flood narrative contains another important element that Jung identifies: the strange story of the sons of God and their offspring with human women. Carl Jung writes in Answer to Job, "The Book of Enoch, written around 100 BC, goes into considerably more detail. It gives a revealing account of the advance of the sons of God into the world of men, another prefiguration which has been described as the fall of the angels. Whereas according to Genesis, Yahweh resolved that his spirit should not abide in man forever, and that men should not live to be hundreds of years old as they had before, the sons of God, by way of compensation, fell in love with the beautiful daughters of men. This happened at the time of the giants." Jung continues, revealing the paradoxical nature of this angelic intervention. Enoch relates that after conspiring with one another, 200 angels under the leadership of Samiazaz descended to earth, took the daughters of men to wife, and begat with them giants 3,000 ells long. The angels, among whom Azazel particularly excelled, taught mankind the arts and sciences. They proved to be extraordinarily progressive elements who broadened and developed man's consciousness, just as the wicked Cain had stood for progress, as contrasted with the stay-at-home Abel. This insight is profound. The supposedly fallen angels bring knowledge and advancement to humanity, just as the wicked Cain represents progress compared to the favored but static Abel. The pattern of divine opposition to human development continues. Thus Jung writes, "In this way they enlarged the significance of man to gigantic proportions, which points to an inflation of the cultural consciousness at that period. And inflation, however, is always threatened with a counterstroke from the unconscious. And this actually did happen in the form of the deluge. So corrupt was the earth before the deluge that the giants consumed all the acquisitions of men, and then began to devour each other, while men in their turn devoured the beasts, so that the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. This interpretation suggests the flood is a psychological counter-reaction to human development. The unconscious, divine mind reacting against the expansion of consciousness with catastrophic destruction. The pattern continues with Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, where humans attempt a collective achievement. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." However, instead of being supportive of initiative and flourishing and community, Yahweh's response reveals the same divine insecurity. Genesis 11 continues, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city." The psychological dynamic is unmistakable. Fear of human potential leads Yahweh to sabotage and punish us. The omnipotent deity feels threatened by divine human cooperation and responds by creating division. A divinity unable to integrate the development of consciousness in his creation. The pattern of selective destruction returns with Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. "Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground." Again, we see mass destruction that would have included the elderly, children, and infants. The psychological pattern persists, divine violence as the primary solution to human moral failure. The message is clear: fear God. Even more revealing is Abraham's negotiation with Yahweh beforehand, where Abraham appeals to divine justice. "That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" This extraordinary passage reveals Abraham possessing moral awareness that Yahweh himself seems to lack, understanding that killing innocents along with the guilty violates basic justice. Dr. Jung elaborates in Aeon. The Midrash on Genesis 18:23, Abraham's plea for Sodom, says Abraham speaking, "If thou desirest the world to endure, there can be no absolute justice, while if thou desirest absolute justice, the world cannot endure. Yet thou wouldst hold the cord by both ends, desiring both the world and absolute justice. Unless thou forgoest a little, the world cannot endure." Abraham has to teach Yahweh ethics, suggesting a deity whose moral development lags behind that of his creation. Perhaps most disturbing in this story is the testing of Abraham, where Yahweh commands, "And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." Even though the sacrifice is ultimately prevented, the psychological implications are profound. Yahweh is the deity who would test devotion through child sacrifice. The same savage and primitive consciousness that has not yet evolved beyond primitive religious forms, beyond its tribal instincts. The deliberate emphasis on emotional pain, which is a central part of Yahweh's sadistic personality, reveals a deity who lacks empathy while demanding total submission. The fact that Abraham complies without moral protest, unlike his earlier defense of potential innocence in Sodom, demonstrates how divine terror can override basic human ethical instincts. In answer to Job, Jung writes, "We know from chapter 22 of Genesis 4 and Exodus 22:29 that Yahweh has a tendency to employ such means as the killing of the son and the firstborn in order to test his people's faith or to assert his will, despite the fact that his omniscience and omnipotence have no need whatever of such savage procedures, which moreover set a bad example to the mighty ones of the earth. It is very understandable, therefore, that a naive mind is apt to run away from such questions and excuse this maneuver as a beautiful sacrificium intellectus. If one prefers not to read the 89th Psalm, the matter will not end there. He who cheats once will cheat again, particularly when it comes to self-knowledge. But self-knowledge, in the form of an examination of conscience, is demanded by Christian ethics. They were very pious people who maintained that self-knowledge paves the way to knowledge of God. By the end of Genesis, a clear psychological pattern is already evident. A deity who creates becomes disappointed with his creation and resorts to violence, banishment, or destruction as his primary solution, over and over again. This establishes the template that will repeat throughout biblical history. This is Saturn's nature as a boundary setter and devourer of his own creations. The deity who creates by division and separation in Genesis 1 is the same deity who divides humanity by confounding language and separates Adam and Eve from Eden and Cain from his community. What is most troubling from a psychological perspective is not that Yahweh exhibits these behaviors, but that he appears unconscious of their contradictions. He demands moral perfection while displaying moral inconsistency. He punishes humans for violence while employing violence on a cosmic scale. He fears human development while claiming to desire a relationship. These contradictions point to what Jung called a divine drama, a deity whose consciousness is itself evolving, who has not yet integrated his own shadow aspects. This drama will continue throughout biblical history, and in the book of Job, divine contradiction can no longer be concealed. As we move forward through the biblical narrative, we must keep sight of these patterns established in Genesis, for they form the psychological foundation upon which the entire divine-human relationship is built. A relationship that is not far from a fatal neurosis at absolute levels. However, remember this piece of wisdom from Jung, again from Answer to Job. A piece of wisdom we should not forget. One can observe the same phenomenon in human beings, wherever in fact people cannot deny themselves the pleasure of their emotions. It must be admitted that a fit of rage or a sulk has its secret attractions. Were that not so, most people would long since have acquired a little wisdom. Now, let's discuss the Exodus. The book of Exodus continues and intensifies the Saturnian patterns established in Genesis. While Genesis revealed Yahweh's tendency toward catastrophic destruction and arbitrary justice, Exodus showcases a more calculated, deliberate form of divine violence, a form of consciousness that evolved in its strategic approach and intelligence, one specifically designed to demonstrate power and instill fear. This characterization of Yahweh as a demiurgic figure rather than an ultimate deity finds surprising resonance even in early Christian thought. According to Jung in Ion, the teachings of Apelles, who had connections with Marcion, described a third God who spoke to Moses, a fiery one, and there was also a fourth, the author of evil. Between the God of the Nasines and the God of Apelles, there is evidently a close relationship, and also, it appears, with Yahweh, the demiurge of the Old Testament. This Gnostic perspective framed Yahweh not as the highest God, but as a lesser creator deity, powerful yet flawed, capable of both creation and destruction, but fundamentally operating from a limited consciousness. This would explain the contradictory nature of divine action throughout Exodus. Yahweh is not the perfect implementation of divine justice, but the inconsistent manifestations of an unintegrated consciousness. A consciousness that is not absolute, at least not yet. The psychological pattern shifts from reactive destruction, as in the flood, to proactive terrorism in service of a specific goal, the establishment of a chosen people through whom Yahweh can experience worship and obedience. The Exodus narrative begins with Yahweh's revelation to Moses at the burning bush, the same Moses who killed an Egyptian for beating a Hebrew. the same Moses who was living a lavish life at the Egyptian court. What a violent protagonist. However, it might have been self-defense. But what if it was an exaggerated reaction? How paradoxical. In fact, it is another Saturnian paradox. The deity who simultaneously reveals and conceals himself, as Exodus 3:2 testifies, "And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed." This theophany exemplifies Saturn's nature as the Sol Niger, the black sun whose darkness illuminates. The bush burns but is not consumed, a perfect symbol of revelation through concealment. When Moses asks for the divine name in Exodus 3:14, Yahweh offers the famously enigmatic response, "And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you." This statement has been celebrated by theologians as a profound expression of divine self-existence, but psychologically it reveals something quite different. A consciousness that can only define itself tautologically, and that lacks the capacity for genuine self-reflection. This circular self-definition, "I am what I am," suggests a primitive consciousness unable to gain perspective on itself. A truly integrated consciousness can define itself in relation to its own qualities and to others. Yahweh's self-naming reveals a consciousness that exists in isolation, unable to achieve the distance necessary for genuine self-knowledge. Let us stay a bit on this passage and contemplate the divine names we encountered. In the original Hebrew, this passage uses several terms. God is referred to as Elohim. The self-identification phrase is Ehyeh asher ehyeh, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. The name to be told to the Israelites is Ehyeh. In the Greek Septuagint, God is ho theos. The self-identification is ego eimi ho on, I am the one who is. The name to be told to the Israelites is ho on, the one who is. The Hebrew Ehyeh is related linguistically to Yahweh and the Tetragrammaton, all deriving from the same root meaning to be or to exist. The Greek translation ho on, the one who is, attempts to capture this meaning of existence, being, rather than transliterating the Hebrew name. This passage represents a significant moment of divine self-revelation, connecting the name with the concept of being or existence. The Greek translation emphasizes the philosophical aspect of God's self-sufficient existence. Looking specifically at Elohim, in this context, the term itself is grammatically plural in Hebrew, but is typically used with singular verb forms when referring to the God of Israel. This linguistic peculiarity has generated various interpretations throughout history. In Exodus 3:14, Elohim speaks to Moses as a singular entity, despite the plural form. Scholars note that this plural yet singular construction may reflect several possibilities: a plural of majesty similar to a royal we, a remnant of polytheistic origins later adapted to monotheism, or possibly a hint at divine complexity within unity. What's significant in this passage is that Elohim identifies himself through the first-person singular, I am, and is clearly presented as one being, not multiple deities. The text establishes that this Elohim is precisely the same deity who will be known by the proper name Yahweh. The plural form of Elohim thus doesn't seem to indicate multiple gods in this context, but rather emphasizes the fullness or completeness of a single divine being who transcends simple categorization. The one who simply is in the most absolute sense. But what if it is all a farce and all gods are masquerading as one God we all call Yahweh? Unfortunately, I don't know, although I want to know. What follows in the Exodus narrative is even more troubling from a psychological perspective. Yahweh reveals to Moses a deliberate strategy of psychological manipulation and terror packaged as a plan of liberation. Exodus 7:3. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. Let's consider the implications of this statement. An omnipotent deity could simply free the Israelites with a thought. Instead, Yahweh reveals a plan to deliberately prevent Pharaoh from releasing the Israelites by hardening his heart, specifically to create the opportunity for a prolonged demonstration of divine power through increasingly devastating plagues. Is this the behavior of a deity primarily concerned with the suffering of his people? Is this the behavior of a deity obsessed with displays of power, with being recognized and acknowledged? The divine plan combines sadism toward the Egyptians with exhibitionism toward all observers. The goal is not merely liberation, but spectacle, a demonstration of divine power designed to be remembered and recounted. The 10 plagues that follow represent a calculated escalation of terror upon an entire population. From the relatively mild, water turning to blood, to the increasingly severe, darkness, death of livestock, to the ultimate horror of the death of children, Yahweh orchestrates a campaign of gradual terror, more reminiscent of modern psychological warfare than divine justice. Between each plague, the text repeats the formula, "And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart." Exodus 9:12. The psychological dynamic is clear again. Yahweh deliberately prevents Pharaoh from relenting specifically to justify the next more terrible plague. Jung comments on this troubling pattern in answer to Job. If Yahweh, as we would expect of a sensible human being, were really conscious of himself, he would, in view of the true facts of the case, at least have put an end to the panegyrics on his justice. But he is too unconscious to be moral. Morality presupposes consciousness. However, Jung adds, "By this I do not mean to say that Yahweh is imperfect or evil, like a Gnostic demiurge. He is everything in its totality. Therefore, among other things, he is total justice and also its total opposite. At least this is the way he must be conceived if one is to form a unified picture of his character." Was this an attempt to justify Yahweh? Probably not. Jung was possibly suggesting Yahweh was the perfect binding of good and evil, of polar opposites, at unimaginable scales. Or at least that's how I would interpret it. The plagues culminate in what can only be described as divine infanticide on a massive scale in Exodus 12. "And it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead." Consider the psychological implications, the deliberate targeting of children, not just the children of Pharaoh, not just the children of his officials, every firstborn throughout Egypt, including those of slaves and prisoners who had no power or influence over Pharaoh's decisions. Even animals, completely innocent of any moral transgression, have their firstborn slaughtered. If a human leader ordered the systematic killing of children to achieve a political goal, we would recognize this as one of the most heinous war crimes imaginable. Yet when Yahweh does it, theologians call it divine justice again. After all, if they can do it with Genesis, they can do it with Exodus. The parallel to Saturn devouring his children is unmistakable. The deity consumes the future of Egypt, its firstborn, only to establish his power and control over the present, on his terms, with his own people. This act of mass infanticide is then commemorated in the institution of Passover, where the Israelites are instructed to mark their doorposts with blood to ensure the destroyer passes over their homes. Exodus 12:23 states, "For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the 2 side posts, the Lord will pass over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer to come in unto your houses to smite you." Thus, the chosen people are instructed to engage in a ritual of blood magic to protect themselves from their own God, who apparently cannot or will not distinguish between Israelites and Egyptians without this bloody marker. And if this is not insanity and lack of control, I don't know what it. Even Talmudic commentary acknowledges the indiscriminate nature of this divine destruction. As Jung notes in Ion, R. Joseph taught, "What is the meaning of the verse? And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning." Exodus 12:22. Once permission has been granted to the destroyer, he doesn't distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Indeed, he even begins with the righteous. This rabbinic interpretation reveals a profound theological insight. Yahweh unleashes forces he cannot or will not fully control. The destroyer operates with a kind of autonomy once released. suggesting that Yahweh's consciousness functions more as a primal force than a discriminating intelligence. The blood ritual thus serves as magical protection, not just from Egyptian danger, but from Yahweh's destructive aspect. A deity so volatile that even his chosen people must take physical precautions against his wrath. This ritual reveals a deity operating at the level of primitive magical thinking. A God who requires physical signs rather than simply knowing his people. A consciousness not integrated. The blood on the doorposts acts as protection and as a mark of allegiance. A visible sign that the occupants accept Yahweh's violent method, a way to become an accomplice to the terror. Obey the powerful tyrant and you will live was the message. Those who do not participate are at risk of divine murder. This establishes a psychological pattern of divine terrorism. Protection is available, but only to those who visibly declare allegiance to the deity responsible for the violence. The drowning of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea is another display of divine violence as spectacle. Thus, Exodus 14 continues the narrative. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. Does this sound to you anywhere near liberation, liberty, or freedom? Or is it about Yahweh's thirst for honor and recognition? The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Again, we see the Saturnian need for acknowledgement and worship, the demand for recognition that defines the primitive divine consciousness. Jung's analysis in Mysterium Conjunctionis reveals a profound psychological interpretation of this Red Sea crossing. He examines the Gnostic Piratic interpretation, wherein the Red Sea drowned the Egyptians, but the Egyptians were all non-knowers. The exodus from Egypt signifies the exodus from the body, which is Egypt in miniature, being the incarnation of sinfulness, and the crossing of the Red Sea is the crossing of the water of corruption, which is Chronos. The other side of the Red Sea is the other side of creation. This perspective transforms the literal narrative into a psychological process. The Red Sea becomes a water of death for those that are unconscious, but for those that are conscious, it is a baptismal water of rebirth and transcendence. The unconscious are those who have no gnosis, no enlightenment regarding human nature and cosmic destiny. In modern terms, those who lack awareness of their personal and collective unconscious. Jung explains, unconscious people who attempt to cross the sea without being purified and without the guidance of enlightenment are drowned. They get stuck in the unconscious and suffer a spiritual death insofar as they cannot get beyond their one-sidedness. This reading reframes Yahweh's act of mass drowning as a psychological metaphor for spiritual transformation through confrontation with the unconscious. Yet this interpretation, while elevating the text to symbolic significance, still reinforces our Saturnian theme. The Red Sea is explicitly linked to Chronos, Saturn, and the boundary between life and death, consciousness and unconsciousness, and salvation and destruction. Even in this psychological reading, Yahweh manifests as the Saturnian force who differentiates, separates, and draws boundaries, determining who shall pass through conscious transformation, and who shall be consumed by unconscious forces. This duality of destruction and salvation echoes the essence of the Saturnian archetype, the force that simultaneously limits and liberates, depending on one's relationship to it. For the Israelites, Saturn Yahweh parts the waters. For the Egyptians, he releases them as a flood of death. The same deity operates as both the God of destruction and the God of salvation, revealing again the fundamental polarity within the Yahwistic consciousness. Moses and the Israelites then celebrate this mass drowning with song. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spake, saying, I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. The celebration of divine violence establishes a psychological pattern. Worship is tied directly to Yahweh's capacity for destruction, and to be in covenant with this God is to celebrate his acts of violence against others. Basically, that's the contract you have to sign with Yahweh if you want a chance to live. In Exodus 19, at Mount Sinai, Yahweh establishes his covenant with the Israelites through a display designed specifically to instill terror. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke. because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. The people are explicitly warned that even approaching the mountain means death. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourselves, that ye go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. This creates a psychological dynamic of terror-based worship. The deity demands obedience, but establishes that relationship through fear rather than love. This Saturn-like boundary setting establishes divine worship as fundamentally based on separation, limitation, and the threat of punishment. The giving of the law itself is framed in terms of threat and punishment, rather than as a gift of wisdom. The famous Ten Commandments begin not with ethical guidance, but with a reminder of Yahweh's power and jealousy. I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth, as per the beginning of Exodus 20. The psychologically revealing element here is the immediate follow-up. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. The deity explicitly acknowledges his devastating jealousy and threatens to punish not only transgressors, but their descendants for multiple generations. Yahweh is obsessed with vengeance, unable to distinguish between individuals and their ancestors. Exactly the kind of primitive thinking that genuine ethical development would seek to overcome. And when the Israelites creates the golden calf, Yahweh's reaction reveals another aspect of his Saturnian nature, uncontrolled rage, leading to planned annihilation in Exodus 32. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. Only Moses' intervention prevents another genocide. The psychological pattern is now familiar. The Creator threatening to destroy his creation when it fails to meet his expectations. The Saturnian figure consuming what he has made, again and again. Even after Moses convinces Yahweh not to destroy the entire people, the divine punishment remains severe. And he said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. 3,000 people were executed for participating in the creation of an idol. Mass slaughter as punishment for broken allegiance. Yahweh demands that Israelites kill their brothers, companions, and neighbors, breaking fundamental human bonds in service of divine jealousy. One of the most revealing moments in Exodus comes when Moses asks to see Yahweh's glory, in Exodus 33. And he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before thee, and will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. And he said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me, and live. This interaction perfectly captures Saturn's nature as the concealed revealer. Yahweh will show only his back, never his face. The divine remains fundamentally hidden even in revelation. The statement, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, reveals the arbitrary nature of divine favor. There is no predictable standard, just Yahweh's divine whim. God knows better what he has in plan for us. But what is the plan? And is it necessary to have a plan that torments humankind? And does Yahweh seem competent enough to make a proper plan? And what will happen next? The danger of this divine unpredictability is further illuminated in midrashic commentary cited by Jung in Ion, commenting on Exodus 33, 5, If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. The midrash says, Yahweh means he could wax wroth with you for a moment, for that is the length of his wrath, as is said in Isaiah 26:20. Hide yourselves for a little moment until the wrath is past, and destroy you. Yahweh gives warning here of his unbridled irascibility. If in this moment of divine wrath a curse is uttered, it will indubitably be effective. That is why Balaam, who knows the thoughts of the Most High, when called upon by Balak to curse Israel, was so dangerous an enemy because he knew the moment of Yahweh's wrath. Jung's commentary reveals a deity defined by emotional volatility, where even a moment of divine anger carries catastrophic consequences. The Exodus narrative reveals a deity operating at a primitive level of consciousness, powerful but unintegrated, demanding worship, but incapable of modeling ethical behaviour. The relationship established with the chosen people is fundamentally one of trauma bonding. The deity simultaneously threatens and protects, harms and rescues. This creates a psychological dynamic similar to what we now call Stockholm Syndrome, attachment formed through fear and the intermittent relief from fear. It's cognitive dissonance too. It's a mind with no will to ascend its individuality. An ant that can't protect his family or anyone else. The Israelites are bound to Yahweh through terror, dependency, and the promise of safety from the very being who threatens them. The Exodus establishes a relationship in which Yahweh demands to be known and acknowledged, yet refuses to be fully known himself. The Saturnian pattern continues. The demand for recognition without reciprocity, the insistence on worship without genuine relationship. The Exodus story concludes with detailed instructions for building the tabernacle, which is a structure designed specifically to contain and manage the divine presence. The psychological function of the tabernacle is also clear. The tabernacle created a controlled environment for divine manifestation, a way to manage the otherwise unpredictable and destructive divine presence. Like Saturn's rings, it establishes a boundary that defines and limits. The elaborate rituals, the physical separation of the Holy of Holies, the restriction that only the high priest can enter once a year. All these elements serve to contain the divine terror established in the earlier parts of Exodus, to feed the beast so it may not get hungry again. The religion that emerges is fundamentally apotropaic, designed to ward off divine wrath rather than to cultivate divine love. By the end of Exodus, the pattern established in Genesis has intensified. Yahweh continues to operate through division and limitation, through the threat of destruction and the demand for worship. But now these patterns are codified into religious law and ritual. What emerges is a religious system that institutionalizes the fear-based relationship with the divine. The chosen people are bound to Yahweh through a mixture of gratitude for liberation and terror of punishment, always aware that divine favor can be withdrawn at any moment. As we move forward into the remainder of the Pentateuch, this pattern will continue to develop, with increasingly elaborate laws and increasingly severe punishments. The Saturnian consciousness continues to express itself through boundary setting, through the division of sacred from profane, clean from unclean, chosen from unchosen. The psychological cost of this religious pattern is immense, producing a consciousness perpetually caught between grandiosity as the chosen and terror of divine punishment. This conflicted psychological state will continue to shape religious consciousness throughout biblical history, eventually demanding the radical reformulation that will emerge in Christianity. Yet even there, as we shall see, the Saturnian pattern remains, transformed but not transcended. In Exodus, more clearly than perhaps anywhere else in Scripture, we see Yahweh operating as the cosmic terrorist, using calculated violence against the innocent, specifically to demonstrate power and instill fear. This is Saturn in his most terrifying aspect, the devourer who consumes not merely out of hunger, but as a deliberate demonstration of absolute control. Maybe that's why the tabernacle was never meant to contain it, but to feed its destructive ego. Let's see what Deuteronomy tells us about Yahweh. Deuteronomy, which means second law, is the final book of the Pentateuch. It is supposedly Moses' farewell address to the Israelites before his death, but psychologically, it reveals perhaps the most naked expression of Yahweh's Saturnian nature, a consciousness obsessed with boundaries, punishments, and absolute control. The book begins with a retelling of Israel's journey, but quickly establishes its primary psychological theme: total obedience or total annihilation. There is no middle ground in Yahweh's consciousness. In Deuteronomy 7, we encounter one of the most disturbing commands in all biblical literature, the command for complete genocide against the Canaanite peoples. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. The text continues with horrifying specificity. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Consider the psychological implications. An omnipotent deity commands not just conquest but extermination, explicitly forbidding mercy. Even more troubling, this genocide is framed as an act of divine love again in Deuteronomy 7. The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because ye were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people. But because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondmen, from the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt. Here we see a profound psychological distortion. Genocide as an expression of love. Divine violence is framed as covenant faithfulness. The Saturnian consciousness at its most terrifying, unable to conceive of relationship except through domination and destruction. There is only black and white with this Yahweh, and oftentimes red. So long as Yahweh behaved like a primitive demonic being and was naively accepted as such, the question of theodicy did not exist. But as soon as he was declared the one and only God, creator and sustainer of all things, the problem became unavoidable. How could a good and loving God command such horrors? The psychological pattern established in Genesis and Exodus intensifies in Deuteronomy, where religious infractions receive increasingly severe punishments. Consider Deuteronomy 13, where even family members must be executed for suggesting worship of other gods. If thy brother, the son of thy mother, or thy son, or thy daughter, or the wife of thy bosom, or thy friend, which is as thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, Let us go and serve other gods which thou hast not known, thou nor thy fathers, namely of the gods of the people which are round about you, nigh unto thee, or far off from thee, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. Thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him. Neither shall thine eye pity him, neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him, but thou shalt surely kill him. Thine hand shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. And thou shalt stone him with stones that he die, because he hath sought to thrust thee away from the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. This passage reveals the extreme jealousy at the heart of the Yahwistic consciousness. A deity so insecure in his divine status that he demands the murder of loved ones for simply suggesting alternatives. The primacy of divine allegiance over all human bonds reveals the fundamentally anti-human aspect of this primitive consciousness. There is no room for freedom. Will has no space to maneuver, even if it exists. What is perhaps most psychologically revealing in Deuteronomy is the conditional nature of the covenant. Unlike the unconditional covenant with Abraham, the Sinai covenant, as restated in Deuteronomy, is entirely conditional, as chapter 28 makes horrifyingly clear. The blessings for obedience are substantial but brief. The curses for disobedience are exhaustive, detailed, and nightmarish. They include every imaginable horror, disease, famine, defeat, enslavement, and even cannibalism. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee. So that the man that is tender among you and very delicate, his eye shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children, which he shall leave. So that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he hath nothing left him in the siege, and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in all thy gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear. For she shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness, wherewith thine enemy shall distress thee in thy gates. If thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance, and sore sicknesses, and of long continuance. The psychological dynamics here are clear, a relationship built on terror and threat. Yahweh's love is entirely conditional, his wrath overwhelming and disproportionate. Once again, he proves that this is not the behaviour of an integrated consciousness, but of a primitive consciousness in the grip of emotional extremes, incapable of moderation or genuine connection with his living creation. Deuteronomy concludes with Moses' death, denied entry into the promised land for a relatively minor transgression, striking a rock instead of speaking to it. This disproportionate punishment of Moses, Yahweh's most faithful servant, reveals again the arbitrary nature of divine justice. The great liberator and lawgiver dies alone, having glimpsed but never entered the promised land, a stark symbol of the conditional, limited nature of Yahweh's favor. By the end of Deuteronomy, the psychological pattern is firmly established, a deity demanding total obedience, promising conditional blessing, and threatening disproportionate punishment. A consciousness operating through division and boundary setting, through threat and terror, rather than through integration and genuine relationship. Once again, Saturn in his most primitive aspect, the archon of limitation who cannot transcend his volatility. The stage is set for the divine drama that will unfold throughout biblical history as this unintegrated consciousness encounters the reality of human suffering and human questioning. The Book of Judges reveals a new phase in the divine drama, cyclical rather than progressive. After the conquest narratives of Joshua, which enact the genocidal commands of Deuteronomy with disturbing literalness, Judges presents a repetitive pattern. Israel sins, Yahweh punishes through foreign oppression. Israel cries out, Yahweh raises a deliverer, judge, followed by temporary peace until the cycle begins again. Yahwistic consciousness is unable to evolve or integrate. Instead of development, we see repetition. Instead of growth, we see the same pattern enacted with different human actors. Perhaps nowhere is the disturbing nature of this consciousness more evident than in the story of Jephthah in Judges 11. Jephthah makes a rash vow. If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be, that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. When his only daughter is the first to greet him, Jephthah feels compelled to sacrifice her. What is psychologically revealing is Yahweh's complete silence. Unlike the near sacrifice of Isaac, where divine intervention prevents child sacrifice, here Yahweh allows the horrific act to proceed. This silence is deafening. It reveals a deity who either approves of child sacrifice or is indifferent to it, not yet developed enough to consistently reject human sacrifice. The text presents Jephthah's daughter mourning her virginity for 2 months before being sacrificed, a detail that only heightens the psychological horror of the narrative. Throughout Judges, Yahweh sanctions extreme violence against enemies, Ehud's assassination of Eglon, Jael's murder of Sisera, Samson's mass killings. Divine favor is measured primarily through military success, revealing a consciousness still operating at the level of tribal deity rather than universal moral being. Most disturbing is the arbitrary nature of divine intervention. Sometimes Yahweh responds immediately to Israel's cries. Other times, he allows prolonged suffering. Sometimes he empowers unlikely heroes. Other times he abandons his people to oppression. Yahweh is inconsistent, unintegrated divine consciousness. He responds from unconscious impulses rather than integrated wisdom. The book concludes with the horrific civil war against Benjamin, triggered by the gang rape and dismemberment of a concubine, a narrative where Yahweh's guidance leads to massive bloodshed on both sides before Benjamin is nearly exterminated. The final verse, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes," attempts to explain the horrors as resulting from human autonomy rather than divine guidance. Yet, psychologically, this explanation fails. The violence and cruelty throughout Judges occur not in Yahweh's absence, but with his explicit approval and often at his direct command. What is revealed is not the danger of human autonomy, but the danger of a divine directive that has not integrated its own shadow. In Judges, we see Saturn not as the wise elder, but as the volatile tribal deity we now know quite well. Demanding worship, frantic temporary victories, unable to establish stable peace or consistent justice. The cycles of apostasy and deliverance reveal a relationship based on trauma bonding. Yahweh still doesn't understand genuine love, and it doesn't even seem to be his domain. But maybe the Kings and Chronicles will say a different story. Kings and Chronicles. The historical books of Kings and Chronicles present the national history of Israel and Judah with a theological touch. However, beneath the surface narrative lies a disturbing psychological revelation. Yahweh's treatment of kings follows no consistent moral pattern. Instead, we see the same arbitrary preferences and disproportionate punishments that characterized earlier divine behavior. Consider David, described as a man after God's own heart, despite his adultery with Bathsheba and murder of Uriah. Yahweh forgives these grievous moral failures with relatively minor consequences. David has a special relationship with Yahweh. Jung writes the following passage in answer to Job. In view of this intense personal relatedness to his chosen people, it was only to be expected that a regular covenant would develop, which also extended to certain individuals, for instance, to David. As we learn from the 89th Psalm, Yahweh told him, "My steadfast love I will keep for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David." And yet it happened that he, who watched so jealously over the fulfillment of laws and contracts, broke his own oath. Modern man, with his sensitive conscience, would have felt the black abyss opening, and the ground giving way under his feet, for the least he expects of his God is that he should be superior to mortal man in the sense of being better, higher, nobler, but not his superior in the kind of moral flexibility and unreliability that do not jib even at perjury. Yahweh is a liar, that's what happens. When David conducts a census of his fighting men in 2 Samuel 24, Yahweh's reaction is catastrophic. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning even to the time appointed. And there died of the people from Dan even to Beersheba 70,000 men. 70,000 innocent people died because of David's administrative decision. How is this fair or just in any way? Yahweh's extreme disproportionate response reveals he is still a primitive retributor. He doesn't know how to measure justice. Even more revealing is David's response in 2 Samuel 24:17. "And David spake unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people, and said, Lo, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let thine hand, I pray thee, be against me, and against my father's house." Here, David displays greater moral awareness than Yahweh himself, recognizing the injustice of punishing the innocent for the guilty. As Jung notes in answer to Job, Job stands morally higher than Yahweh. In this respect, the creature has surpassed the Creator. Even more importantly, Jung writes in the same work, "Of course, one must not tax an archaic God with the requirements of modern ethics. For the people of early antiquity, things were rather different. In their gods there was absolutely everything. They teemed with virtues and vices. Hence they could be punished, put in chains, deceived and stirred up against one another without losing face, or at least not for long." The man of that epoch was so inured to divine inconsistencies that he was not unduly perturbed when they happened. With Yahweh, the case was different because from quite early on, the personal and moral tie began to play an important part in the religious relationship. In these circumstances, a breach of contract was bound to have the effect not only of a personal but of a moral injury. One can see this from the way David answers Yahweh, "How long, Lord? Wilt thou hide thyself forever? Shall thy wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. Wherefore hast thou made all men in vain? Lord, where are thy former loving kindnesses, which by thy faithfulness thou didst swear to David?" Had this been addressed to a human being, it would have run something like this. "For heaven's sake, man, pull yourself together and stop being such a senseless savage. It is really too grotesque to get into such a rage when it's partly your own fault that the plants won't flourish. You used to be quite reasonable and took good care of the garden you planted instead of trampling it to pieces." This translation of divine human communication into human-human terms reveals something essential about Yahweh's psychology. Jung, by recasting the conversation in everyday language, exposes the primitive nature of Yahweh's consciousness compared to human moral development. The fact that we can easily imagine a more reasonable response than Yahweh's suggests that human ethical awareness has evolved beyond the divine consciousness that supposedly created it. What Jung subtly demonstrates here is that Yahweh operates with the emotional regulation of a toddler. Sudden rage, disproportionate reactions, and inability to take responsibility for outcomes he partially created. This emotional dysregulation wouldn't be tolerated in human relationships, yet it forms the foundation of the divine human covenant. The faithful are expected to tiptoe around divine triggers, to manage Yahweh's emotions lest his wrath consume them, creating a relationship dynamic that modern psychology would identify as deeply unhealthy. The same pattern appears in the divided kingdom narratives. Solomon's idolatry should logically receive greater punishment than Jeroboam's political calculation, yet Yahweh's reactions are inconsistent. Some kings receive immediate punishment for relatively minor transgressions. Others commit great evil for decades before divine judgment arrives. Jung writes in Answer to Job, "In spite of these precautions, the contract had gone to pieces with David, an event which left behind it a literary deposit in the scriptures, and which grieved some few of the devout, who upon reading it became reflective. As the Psalms were zealously read, it was inevitable that certain thoughtful people were unable to stomach the 89th Psalm. However that may be, the fatal impression made by the breach of contract survived. It is historically possible that these considerations influenced the author of the book of Job. The broken covenant with David reveals another aspect of Yahwistic inconsistency. Despite promising in 2 Samuel 7 that thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee, thy throne shall be established forever, the Davidic line is eventually dethroned and the kingdom gets destroyed. The chances were slim from the beginning, David. This contradiction between unconditional promise and conditional fulfillment reveals the psychological trap that Yahweh consistently sets throughout biblical history. He offers absolute commitment to draw his chosen ones into deep dependency, then introduces hidden conditions after the relationship is established. This is the classic pattern of the abuser. Promise everything to create attachment, then shift the terms once the victim is emotionally invested. Saturn's nature as a boundary setter manifests here as the constant moving of goalposts. The unconditional becomes conditional. The eternal becomes temporary. What was promised forever ends within a few generations. This pattern creates a psychological state of perpetual anxiety in the faithful, never knowing when or why divine favor might be withdrawn, living in constant fear of inadvertently triggering divine rage. The covenant with David epitomizes this Saturnian bait and switch. The steadfast love promised forever evaporates at the first divine disappointment, revealing that the contract was never truly binding on the deity himself. As Jung notes, this revelation left behind it a literary deposit in the scriptures, and which grieved some few of the devout, who upon reading it became reflective. This reflection represents a crucial moment in religious consciousness, the dawning awareness that the divine might be less reliable than the human. This is a contradiction. You make unconditional promises, and only later do you bring the conditions written in small letters. This is certainly the product of a consciousness at war with itself. Yahweh makes absolute commitments it cannot or will not honor. And everything seemed so good in the beginning, but eventually Yahweh proved his ignorance. Perhaps most disturbing in these historical narratives is the divine approval of violence in conquest. From Joshua's genocidal campaigns, to David's bloody expansionism, to Jehu's slaughter of Ahab's descendants, military violence receives explicit divine sanction. When Elijah slaughters 450 prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, this mass execution is presented not as religious terrorism, but as divine triumph. In Kings and Chronicles, we see Saturn as the blood-soaked tribal deity, demanding absolute allegiance and maintaining power through fear rather than love. The destruction of both Israel and Judah, presented as divine punishment, reveals a deity who would rather destroy his chosen people than evolve his relationship with them without always pressing the reset button. These historical narratives reveal an unconscious projection. The deity reveals the same violence, jealousy, and inconsistency that characterized the tribal consciousness of the time. The cosmic drama is playing out not only in history, but in the collective psyche, as the God image gradually takes shape through projection and retrojection. This process of projection and retrojection creates a circular reinforcement of primitive consciousness that perpetuates psychological fragmentation. Humans, operating from tribal consciousness, project their most primitive impulses, rage, jealousy, and vengeance, onto the deity. The deity, now invested with these qualities, becomes the justification for expressing these same impulses in human conflict. God commands us to destroy our enemies, becomes the perfect circular logic that prevents both human and divine consciousness from evolving toward integration. What makes Kings and Chronicles particularly revealing is how transparently this process unfolds in the historical narratives. The theological interpretation of history consistently frames military victory as divine favor and military defeat as divine punishment, regardless of the moral qualities of the participants. A deity who functions primarily as the cosmic endorser of whoever currently holds power emerges, but it is a projection of political authority rather than moral wisdom. The psychological consequence is profound. By attributing to Yahweh the most primitive impulses of tribal consciousness, conquest, genocide, blood vengeance, these impulses become sanctified rather than examined. The shadow remains unintegrated, both in the divine image and in the human psyche that created it. The blood-soaked history of Israel and Judah thus becomes not a cautionary tale of primitive consciousness, but a divine drama in which violence is repeatedly sanctified as the will of God. One book at a time, and even Psalms. My fellow seekers of truth, as you can see, we've already ventured deep into the shadow of Yahweh through Genesis, Exodus, and now Kings and Chronicles. The psychological patterns are undeniable, a consciousness operating through division and destruction, through arbitrary favor and disproportionate punishment. The Saturnian nature of this deity reveals itself in each biblical book we examine. But our journey has only begun. I must pause here, as this revelation has already grown beyond what a single video can contain. In part 2, we will confront the most profound theological crisis in the entire Bible, the book of Job, where the divine shadow can no longer be concealed and must be directly confronted. We will explore Jung's revolutionary analysis in Answer to Job, where he dares to suggest that the creature has surpassed the creator in moral awareness. We will dive deeper into Jung's alchemical works, Psychology and Alchemy, Aeon and Mysterium Conjunctionis, to understand how the divine shadow might be integrated rather than merely projected. And finally, we will confront the book of Revelation where, despite the intervening drama of incarnation, the same Saturnian pattern of cosmic destruction returns with even greater intensity. If you found value in these revelations, if you've been awakened to patterns that were always there but rarely acknowledged, I ask you to help this message reach those who need it. Like, subscribe, share, These simple actions amplify truth in a world that prefers comfortable darkness to uncomfortable light. Leave a comment with your thoughts. What resonated with you? What challenged you? What new connections have you made to your own understanding of the divine? Remember, the pursuit of truth doesn't care about anyone's feelings, but it does care about you finding your way to enlightenment. This is not about destroying faith, but elevating it beyond primitive consciousness to something truly worthy of the human spirit that has, in many ways, already surpassed its creator. Until our next revelation, this is Irrevelato, unveiling what has always been visible to those with eyes to see.